Give you another round of applause for John. I think, it takes quite some, courage, innovation, and creativity to be someone like John Mahasi, who is actually a colleague scholar who was a lecturer in this university a few years ago, and then decided to jump into the deep end, going into consultancy. And as you know, people who have been in consultancy work or running civil society organizations or things like those, it's very easy to tender your resignation at a university or an organization, but where you're going to get your salary 6 months down the line. It can start all well with a big contract, and then as you know, in consultancy, things can dry out. So I think, but he has shown the pathway is cut, the way forward for those of us who might want to go beyond the university walls and the lecture rooms and attempt other creative ways of knowledge production and of being effective. I just wanted to mention very quickly that we've had a couple of challenges this morning because suddenly, as John has alluded, the minister in charge of interior affairs in this country declared a public holiday suddenly. I will have reached out, if I knew, I'll have reached out to say, no, look, we have international guests. We have been planning this conference for 6 months. You cannot do this to us. We are equally, citizens of this country and of the world. But I think it is beyond us, and we have to just make do with the fact that we'll proceed with a couple of our Kenyan colleagues perhaps not joining. I've just received, for example, a call from the Minister of Information and Communication, Professor Edward Kisiangani, who had agreed actually to come last minute. He cancelled. We have Ambassador Paul Ndungu, Foreign Service Academy. He's agreed to come. He has also cancelled. We have Professor Patrick Maluki, who is not only chairman of the Department of International Studies at University of Nairobi, but also chairman of Council of Foreign Service Academy. They all have to be at the swearing-in ceremony. So you'll bear with us on that. Number two is that as we go into day 2, which is our final day, we are saying this conference is not just a talking shop. It's the inaugural conference, and we intend to host the next one next year. In fact, let me just mention in passing that the government of Namibia and Namibia University of Science and Technology have shown great interest in hosting the next one, but subject to discussion and confirmation. And so the critical thing that we have to do today, apart from everything else, is to come up with recommendations that then give us the mandate, the justification to reach out to multiple partners, to grow the partnership beyond what we have today, and start planning early. Address some of the challenges we've had in this inaugural one, make it better for next year. So as we discuss today, let's have that in mind. I think very lastly, we will be also discussing the knowledge production aspect of this conference. We intend to go into book publishing, journal articles, thought leadership articles, and so forth, now that we've launched officially, and we've discussed many of the ideas. We'll be undertaking that, and those will be discussed. But at this point, without further ado, let me invite Professor Gilbert Kadiagala, who is Professor Emeritus in the International Relations Department at the University of Witwatersrand. I am currently Director of the African Center for the Study of the U.S. He was the inaugural director. We share a lot because he also happens to be Kenyan living in South Africa, like myself. And I think Professor Gilbert Kadiagala holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in the U.S. He also a master's from Canada and a bachelor's from University of Nairobi. He is greatly published. He's actually a living legend, but he's very humble. You will never know that. When people get to meet Professor Kadiagala, they are like, oh, is it him? The one that we've read about, the one who's been a leading figure particularly in peace and security studies on the continent. So without further ado, welcome Professor Kadiagala, and a round of applause to him.
Thank you, Bob, and you've been very kind in your introduction. Colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really excited to be here and to have obtained the invitation to speak to the topic on African agency, but focusing specifically on the African Union. I appreciate the invitation from Bob and the ACSUS team that is here. I think as Bob has mentioned, I was director of ACSUS, the founding director, from 2018 until last year, and I was happy to leave the big mantle to Bob, and they are doing an excellent job. The subject of my presentation is the AU's external relations architecture and mechanisms, fit for purpose or due for rethinking. And this is, I think, a very inviting topic, in large part because it speaks to an area that has always formed a larger part of my research, which is the issue of what is Africa's position in the world? What is Africa's contribution to global politics? But it also stems from my conviction that in fact you cannot have African voices globally unless we are organized, unless we are confident about ourselves, unless we are competent. And I'll keep coming back to the issue around African agency as essentially a question of the search for competence and dignity to be effective players globally. In answering the question, therefore, how has Africa positioned itself to play this role globally? Most of my research has focused on the nature of African institutions. And we had this yesterday, whether we're talking about regional economic institutions or continental institutions, such as the AU. Africa is more confident when it is, in fact, organized around continental and sub-regional institutions. And also this stems from the point that alone we cannot do it. So the issue around collective efforts, collective energies is very central to our larger discussion of agency. So I've always believed that collective action and integration should be in fact the starting point for Africa's interaction with external actors. Bob gave me the subtitle my presentation, are AU's external mechanisms fit for purpose, or do they, in fact, need rethinking? I like that question because it recalls Paul Kagame's report in 2017 on AU reforms, where he was speaking about the same question, asking, is the AU fit for purpose since its creation? This year, Kagame made a presentation at the African Union where he was addressing that question. And I'll ask everybody to read it because he said, yes, the AU is now fit for purpose. And he goes at length to explain what he thinks are really the good things that have happened since he raised the question. So today I've been challenged, in fact, to respond to that question, but through the lens of African partnerships. Are they fit for purpose? or do they need rethinking? So I like that question because it revisits, as I said, Kagame's problem earlier. So my presentation is a very small part of a larger project that I'm actually doing for Bob and ACSUS. So I thought the best way to save some time is essentially to look at some of what I call the big themes that inform my discussion on African AU partnerships, or essentially African partnerships with the globe. So the way I've divided the discussion is looking, first of all, focusing on what are these existing partnerships that Africa or the African Union have had with the rest of the world? What is the problem, and what are the strength of these partnerships? So I thought I'll just speak very quickly so that I get rid of that, that issue about what I'm talking about. But I'll also briefly discuss the issue around the expectations of African agency at the moment when we are creating the AU, early 2000s. What were the framers of the African Union, what I call the Renaissance Club? What did they expect of this big notion of agency? How was it going, in fact, to be articulated? So I'll speak a little bit about that. And then what I thought I would do in the conclusion is simply to give you a typology of what I'm calling useful and not so useful partnerships. And then we can build from that typology to say where are we going wrong and what should we be doing better. What then are these existing partnerships? It's important to recall that since its formation in 2002, let's just say 2000, the African Union has committed to broadening its external reach in bids to enhance Africa's global leverage and stature. So it's a very noble goal. We are creating a new institution that is going to allow us to broaden our global reach and stature. And this vision is captured in 2013 when the AU comes up to articulate the Agenda 2063. And Agenda 2063 is very, very, very clear on partnerships. It says we need an Africa that is playing a creative and a dynamic role in international affairs as part of this new renewal for Africa's engagement with the rest of the world. So more vital, I think, the AU predicates the desire to diversify its global linkages on Africa's long-standing aspiration to reduce Africa's overexposure to external competition. And this is what we did in the 60s. We need to expand our links with the rest of the world, but we have to be careful that we are not overexposed to global competition. But at the same time, we need to expand our global partnerships because we need to accrue resources for security and prosperity. So those two elements still remain really the drivers of partnerships. You want to do much in order to get as more resources from the global community without overexposing yourself. Therefore, in the quest for that objective of resources and the fear of entanglement in global competition, the AU has encouraged boosting long-standing cooperation with traditional powers. And the partnerships you see, the AU-EU partnerships coming up in 2000 when the EU says, no, we need new relationships with Africa. what are these relationships going to be? We have to acknowledge the leadership of the African Union as we go forward. And then, of course, you have what was discussed quite a lot yesterday on the Forum for Africa and China FOCAC. Then we have the Franco-African summits, a little bit of a discussion yesterday on TICAD, the Tokyo International Conference on Africa. In more recent years, we see the AU initiating new cooperative frameworks with some of the emerging powers through summits such as Africa-India, Africa-Italy, Africa-Turkey, Africa-South Korea, Africa-Saudi Arabia, Africa-Russia. These are the summits that constitute what we are now going to call the search for a new partnership. There is also an anticipation that we are going to have Africa going into partnerships with bigger blocs like Asia, like Latin America. I remember before Hugo Chavez died, they organized a meeting in Venezuela where they were trying to say, we need to begin to talk about a larger Africa, Latin America, and I was invited to that meeting. And it was not very clear who the drivers were, except for Hugo Chavez and the Nigerians. So a search for bigger frameworks around blocs. As we can tell from the numbers of these partnerships, what I want to emphasize here, these partnerships are proliferating. And proliferation is not a good word. In fact, proliferation speaks to what I'm calling the frantic search for partnerships. We are all over the place. We are determined to put Africa on the global map through these kinds of arrangement. And I'm saying on one hand that that's not a bad agenda. However, despite this frantic search for allies over the past 2 decades, there are very serious debates about the efficacy of this policy in deepening African agency in global affairs. So the questions that frame my discussion or my entry into these debates is one, to what extent have these multiple partnerships contributed to contributing effective African voices globally? There are many, they are ongoing, but I don't really know whether in fact they do contribute to African agency. Does the proliferation of partnerships hamper or hinder African effective positions in core global issues? Does Africa's perennial invitations and participation in these summits add value to African development and even security? So we have to quibble, we have to question the value of these partnerships, particularly as they proliferate. So here is my argument. And the argument simply says, these partnerships have had a very mixed record of enhancement of Africa's agency. These questions, therefore, constitute the gist of my analysis of Africa's external relations and architecture, particularly the issue of the premises, the promises, and the pitfalls of these partnerships. And this is something we need to interrogate. The good news is the global shift towards multilateralism, multipolarity has in fact certainly improved AU and Africa's room for maneuver among bigger players. So the argument I'm making here is that Africa's agency or potential agency has been boosted in the circumstances of its increasing attractiveness to both major and emerging powers. Africa, in fact, is one of the main beneficiaries of multipolarity because the more the world becomes multipolar, the more Africa can inject its voices within that bigger global, changing global world. However, I also argue that the choice, the content, and the purpose of partnerships matters significantly for a continent that has always looked outside for all its solutions. So we've never really departed from that dynamic that we are trying to run away from the 60s, that we are looking at partners. We are searching for partners. And that, I think, is my main point here, that we are distracted from doing other things that I'll look at. So 60 years since the momentous process of decolonization, Africa, and particularly its leading continental institutions, need to be strategic in the choice of partnerships. They need to be very clear in delineating who our friends are and what these friends can be doing for us. And I don't see that kind of discussion in the summits that we keep being invited to. We go there without a very clear objective. What would that mean, therefore, in the choice, in the strategic choice of partnerships? I think my point is that it would entail more selectivity in the choice of partners. If we thought more strategically, we would be more strategic, we would be more selective. We would have partnerships defined very clearly with objectives that are set. Rather than, I think, the current setup, the current trajectory of haphazard and multi-purpose partnerships. So that's the critique of what I see as a process that is running without a very specific agenda, without tangible outcomes. Related to that argument, therefore, is my point that Africa needs a moratorium on partnerships. And the AU, in fact, needs to pronounce itself on the issue, how many are we going to have? How beneficial are these partnerships? That's why I'm arguing that we need a moratorium. Furthermore, the most important partnerships Africa has is the partnerships with itself, is the partnerships with its people, is the partnerships with its own institutions, before we start running out and looking for those partners. So if there has to be any rethinking of our African partnerships, it has to be, Bob, in the direction of internal African partnerships at two levels. And this is not a new story. The first level is rationalizing and strengthening regional economic institutions. We haven't done a good job. These are just shells. They don't have life in them. And we have to say, we need to be serious about strengthening our regional economic institutions. Rationalization would also mean we are getting rid of some of them. There are too many. I've always argued, in fact, Savala, my friend, when talking about IGAD many years ago, and I was saying, this is an institution that needs to be abolished. What is it doing? The kind of work it's doing should be left to NGOs. And then you have a bigger East African community. And then we have institutions such as CENSAD that Muammar Gaddafi created. And this is also another shell, and is recognized by the African Union as a REC, a regional economic community. So this can't go on. The rationalization and the strengthening of these institutions, they should be